was continuing the story of my ancestors, continuing the journey.
What is your favorite childhood memory?
Oh, one of my favorites is going horseback riding when we went back I think it was when we went back to Nebraska, but it was riding on my own horse. The mother's name was Pride, and I rode on the colt was Joy. That was one of my favorite memories because you have so much freedom. And the other one was going to the library so often that they told me, don't even bother to use your library card because you're going to bring the books right back. I read all the Nancy Drew mysteries. I still read mysteries. I love mysteries. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, To Kill a Mockingbird. So I read a lot of those. But I also read a lot of biography, a lot of history books. So I can tell you about a whole lot of people, just because the history section, it wasn't that many kids going to the history section, so I didn't have to wait online. And then I fell in love with history.
Do you know how many books you have read over your whole lifetime?
It's thousands. I read on an average about 3 to 5 books a week. So I make use of the time on the train, on the bus, while I'm waiting for something. If I'm cooking, I'm reading, but I'm not burning the food. But I'm cooking and reading. But, I've read constantly, always.
Was there a certain genre of books you like to read?
Oh, yes. Historical fiction, science fiction, especially science fiction by Black authors.
Gotta love that fiction.
Gotta love that fiction. However, if you read some of the historical nonfiction, then you understand how the fiction emerged. You understand the backstory.
Right, you need some entertainment and some education.
Well, absolutely, I agree 100%.
What in science fiction interests you?
Well, you know what I liked about science fiction in the 60s? Because we thought it was science fiction, and then we look up and we're already there. But what I like about science fiction, again, it's how to move through time. When Octavia Butler, when you read her works, she takes you to the past, to the history, when we weren't slaves, when we were, it just takes you through layers. That's what I like about science fiction. You travel. Time Machine, H.G. Wells, The Avengers, Time Machine.
Did you have to have a school with, Black people at one school and white people at another?
No, I went to a public school just as World War II had ended, the Korean War was going, and in order to ensure that some schools stayed open, they began to integrate the school. So the school I went to was integrated. And the classes I was in were integrated. We had white and Black students. And so I didn't have to go to a segregated school. But my church was. The social life was segregated. So you had, again, these dual experiences where you went to school with a little bit of everybody, but your social life was Black.
At your time, what was famous?
Shirley Chisholm started her first campaign in our living room. John Killens was writing a lot of significant books. The Civil Rights Title VII Act was passed in 1965 and 66. The March on Washington, I watched on television while my parents went down to Washington, D.C. The Vietnam War was starting, and we were protesting that. Girls weren't allowed to wear pants to school, so 5 of us did, and we got expelled, and then we kept doing it, and finally New York State changed its law. So, young ladies, if you can wear pants to school, you can thank me later on. I don't have a problem with it. Well, what we did, it was a really bitter winter, and my mother grew up in Nebraska on a ranch, and she told me, don't wear a skirt, put on some pants, and go to school. And so I went to school, and the dean called me in the office and said, young ladies don't wear pants to school. And I said, this young lady does. My mother told me. And so it was still a lot of snow the next day. We went back, and there was a few more people figuring out, what do we have to lose? And so finally, other schools began to catch on, because it also was a signal that women could wear what made sense, that it wasn't just about looking pretty, but what made sense. They had us wearing this ugly gym suit, which really didn't do much for you, and it didn't fit everybody's body. And so not every girl would feel comfortable going to gym. So it was like extensions of things. And he gradually began to launch through the student movement that we had about civil rights and against the war. It became this conglomerate of issues, and then people felt that they could speak up. And so we petitioned the Board of Regents, we petitioned our public officials, and eventually ordinances were passed that gave quote-unquote permission. They started out simple by telling us you could wear pants, but you had to have a long top over it. And then we soon got rid of that, because people need to be able to wear what they can afford as long as it fits them well. But you have to dress in a manner that dignifies you. But at the same time, if it's 2 degrees outside, don't ask me to wear a skirt, because it ain't gonna happen. But it wasn't something that happened overnight, and it meant that you had to make a commitment. And that's the foundation of protests. You have to make a commitment, because it's not gonna be over easy, and in some cases, still ain't over. My family are generations of what you used to call race people or civil rights people. Now you call them social justice or sacred activists. But this is our makeup, this is our DNA. So it was a given that you would be involved in one way or another. It was a given that you would get a good education, but you also knew how to use your hands, but you knew how to speak up, but you had to do the research. And so the people around me, this was who around me. It was the ethics of the group. Even the sorority I belonged to, we had to volunteer, and we had to teach others. So it wasn't just about being in a club and looking pretty, which we did very well, but it was about, what are you doing for the community? And so it isn't that your life was all about protest, but it was about the sacredness of being a human being, the rights of the African American and others in the community, and really looking at the fullness of who we were as human beings. So it was continuing the story of my ancestors, continuing the journey.
So you're saying like that making sure things go smoothly was like put in your DNA pretty much.
I don't know if it's making things go smoothly, but I would say that being conscious about my obligation to others, yes, it's a significant part of who I am. When I watched the March on Washington on television, I was afraid for my parents because we didn't know if they would come back alive. The 60s were like that. You'd go out the door and you'd go to a protest and you weren't sure if you was going to make it back. At the same time, it told you there was a realm of possibility, that there was a realm of greatness that started long before, and that the civil rights era was only an era of the many, many generations of the effort to be free in a lot of ways. And again, because of the kind of people that came in our house that were friends of my parents, I could sit on the steps in the house and I could listen to conversations. And even if at that time it didn't quite make sense to you, later on, the pieces would kind of fall into place. My family was from the Midwest, and so in New York, people didn't believe that if you were black, you were from the Midwest. They thought you were lying. I had long, straight hair that I could sit on, so so black folks didn't like me, white folks didn't like me, and if they knew that my parents were Native American as well as African American and Irish, if they knew we were this mix, my mother would not have been able to get a job. So you had to have an identity outside the house, and you had to have another identity in the house. So what it taught me was that I had to be true to my core, and sometimes I had to keep my business to my business and not make it your business.
At your time, what were like police officers like?
By the time I started coming up, there began to be a few more African American officers. You saw more policemen on the street. There was more community. They call it now community policing, but at the time, they walked the patrol, so you had the consistent police officers. They knew who was who. It didn't always mean it was fair, but everybody knew everybody. But there were challenges then, just as there are now. But we understood why the police were there, but we also understood what was our obligation to ensure safety in the community. So we had block associations, and we had community groups, and we had block watchers. So we took ownership of our community and respected each other a great deal. It wasn't angelic, but there was knowledge about who was who.
Who is your hero?
My mother and my grandmother. I was given a mantle by my mother and my grandmother, who told me there are those who will tell the story, there are those who will lead, teach, and heal. And that was my mantle, that was my responsibility, that was my purpose for this life. And so, good thing I like doing it. You know, when I tried not to do it, life wasn't so settled. But when I got back to doing more of it, and what's interesting about telling a story, even if it's fiction, it comes out of a human experience of something that happened, and the writer is trying to recall those threads. So storytelling tells the listener to step outside of where they are that moment and consider something else. I call it the realm of possibility. Why can't I be? Let me give you an example. I wanted to be an anthropologist when I was a young girl. But in the 60s, they told you black girls don't do that. So I became other things. So the writing, the fiction that I write, the mystery that I write, the protagonist is an anthropologist. She's a black woman like myself. She looks just like me. That's the value.
The Grandparents StoryLab is produced by Clara Ibarra and Rachel Bongiorno. For more stories or to get in touch, go to our website, thegrandparentstorylab.org.